Semester number 2, lesson number 27. Our aim today is how did the events ending World War II lead to the need for or development of a United Nations? And really today what we're going to talk about is the concept of a global world where, the United States moves forever out of that policy of isolationism and neutrality and realize that they need to be part of a global community. And that's all going to be because of World War II and the events of World War II and the end of World War II. So the first thing we're going to talk about are the Nuremberg trials. All right, a lot of German officers were still alive after the war, after the surrender, and the idea of the Nuremberg trials were to punish those responsible for committing the terrible acts of the Holocaust. And these weren't low-ranking, soldiers. These were the generals and whatnot. And the war crimes trials in Nuremberg were in 1945 and 1946. They were world courts, meaning they were run by all of the countries of the world, really, that were involved. And 12 Nazi leaders were sentenced to death for crimes against humanity. And those crimes against humanity dealt, obviously, with the Holocaust. All right. Remember, during the Holocaust, nearly 6 million people, mostly Jews, but also gypsies, homosexuals, those who were mentally disabled, lost their lives because of the regime that was in place in Germany. All right. Now, with this idea of a global world, the Nuremberg trials was the first step towards a global community. And that global community was established with the United Nations. All right. The United Nations is basically a collection of countries that work together for the betterment of the world. All right. The United Nations was founded in response to World War II and the failure of the League of Nations. If you recall, after World War I, all right, a League of Nations was established. If you guys remember, Woodrow Wilson tried to establish this global community, and other countries agreed to it. However, Woodrow Wilson is the one who proposed it, and the United States says no to it because they want to go back into a policy of neutrality. After World War II, the United States realized that it cannot be neutral, and they joined this new basically League of Nations 2.0, known as the United Nations. And the purpose of the UN, or United Nations, is to prevent and intervene in conflicts between nations and make future wars impossible or limited. The job of the United Nations is not to be a fighting force. It's to be a peacekeeping entity, which their purpose is really to prevent war. All right? They do have a standing army, but their job is to try to prevent war by any means necessary. The United Nations was created in 1945 with the signing of the United Nations Charter by 51 countries. All right, it was an international organization whose aims are to facilitate cooperation in international law. Basically, they wanted to create an international security, or really a security of the entire world, work on economic development of countries who were struggling economically, to create social progress for all people of the world, to create and establish human rights norms for every part of the world, meaning there are certain ways humans should be treated. And if we look back even to John Locke with his natural rights, this was something that had been established hundreds of years before, and now you have a governing body that is trying to make sure this happens. And the final thing they were fighting for was world peace. And this is a breakdown of the United Nations. You don't need to know this, inside and out, but it's good for you guys to have an idea of just how intricate the United Nations is. They have the General Assembly, where they discuss world problems, they vote on actions, they control the budget, the United Nations budget. You have the Secretariat, which coordinates work of all United Nations agencies. It's headed by the Secretary General. You have the Security Council, which investigates situations that threaten peace, sets UN policies, and works for peaceful settlements of disputes. And then on the bottom, you have the Economic and Social Council, the Trusteeship Council, and the International Court of Justice. All these are parts of the United Nations. And if you guys want to look at this a little more, you may. Just shows you that they have a lot of different parts to the United Nations. And probably one of the biggest things in the United Nations was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we're going to read in a few minutes. The Declaration arose directly from the experience of the Second World War and represents the first global expression of rights to which all human beings are inherently entitled. I mean, this really was the first time that the entire world is said, here are human rights that everyone should have. All right. It was actually written by FDR's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. And today there are 192 member states of the United Nations, all of whom have signed on in agreement with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So in order to be considered for admission into the United Nations, you have to agree to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Check for understanding. An important effect of World War II on the United States foreign policy was a 1. Refusal to become involved in world affairs. 2. Smaller role for the president in foreign policy and national security issues. 3. Stronger commitment to collective security and world leadership. Or 4. Willingness to intervene only when the national economy is involved. And we will talk about that answer tomorrow, as well as go over our work for tomorrow in class. Have a good night.